Good day, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you and welcome to our panel on the war in Ukraine, the counteroffensive, and the role of the West. Whether you're joining from the US, from Minnesota, from elsewhere in the US, from Western or Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, thank you for being here and for your interest in this incredibly important and ongoing war. My name is Kathleen Collins. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Minnesota, where I have been researching and teaching the politics of Russia, the USSR, and its former republics for the past 18 years. I am joined today by four esteemed colleagues, international experts on Ukraine, Russia, and the ongoing war. They bring to the table vast experience in foreign policy, the military, and sociological research. Coming from Ukraine and its close neighbors and supporters, Lithuania and Poland, they are much closer to the war than we are in the United States. So we are eager to learn from their perspectives. I will unfortunately have to say at the start that Professor Volodymyr Dubovik has had a family emergency in Ukraine and so is sadly not with us today. I'm going to briefly introduce the other speakers gathered with us today, and then we will turn to a welcoming video and some brief remarks by Senator Amy Klobuchar. To my left is Maria Zolkina, who is currently the David Davies of Lentem Research Fellow in the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics. She is also head of regional security and conflict studies at one of the most respected Ukrainian think tanks, and the Democratic Initiative Foundation. She is also, I should note, from the occupied territories of Ukraine and is happy to speak about the personal situation for Ukrainians who are still living there. Colonel Bagdonas is joining us from Vilnius, Lithuania today. Colonel Bagdonas, Gintaras Bagdonas, retired from the Armed Forces of Lithuania in 2021. He is currently a lecturer at the General Jonas Žemaitis Military Academy of Lithuania. Prior to his retirement, Colonel Bagdonas served as military representative of NATO military staff in Georgia and as a liaison officer in the South Caucasus. He's had a long and distinguished career in both within the military and now within military academia. Professor Przemysław Zurawski-Wilgrajewski joins us from Poland, from Warsaw. He is currently an advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland and also an advisor to the Parliamentary Committee of Foreign Affairs. He has served as the head of the Security and Defense Council, the National Development Council, in the Office of the President of Poland. And he is a professor of political science and history at the University of Łódź. And he will be speaking from his both policy and academic expertise as well. We're eager to learn from all of these panelists today. But first, however, we will turn to the brief welcoming statement and remarks by Senator Amy Klobuchar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee for all you've done to make this event possible. As our Ukrainian partners continue to bravely defy Vladimir Putin's inhuman barbarism, today's discussion could not be more timely. I know you're going to hear from some incredible foreign policy leaders and scholars today, and I'm grateful to give some welcoming remarks. Everyone gathered today shares a belief in government based on the principles of democracy and decency, both at home and abroad. After World War II, we made it clear, big countries can't invade little countries. Our fight is not only a fight for Ukraine, it is a fight for defending democracy and sovereignty around the world. As President Zelensky said earlier this year at the United Nations, if we allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? We know Vladimir Putin is an aggressor. He launched an unprovoked, unjustifiable, unlawful invasion. But despite Putin's worst efforts, the Ukrainian people are still standing. Since the invasion last year, Ukraine has reclaimed 50% of the territory that Russia unlawfully seized from them. As the Ukrainians advance, Vladimir Putin is failing. He tried to capture Kyiv, but he failed. He sought to wipe Ukraine off the map, but he failed. He tried to drive a wedge between the US and our partners, but he failed. He sought to topple the Ukrainian government, but he failed. Vladimir Putin tried to break the Ukrainian spirit, but he has made it stronger. He tried to break NATO, but NATO added a member state. Our Ukrainian partners have persevered against all odds. When Vladimir Putin tried to weaponize winter, Ukraine kept the lights on. When he tried to stop them from producing and selling grain, Ukraine found a way forward. In his visit to Washington in September, President Zelensky made it clear: Ukraine, as we know it, depends on US and NATO support. To abandon Ukraine now would be a dereliction of duty. I've had the privilege of visiting Ukraine twice in the last few years. Each time I was struck by the strength of the Ukrainian people who are putting their lives on the line every single day for their nation. Ballerinas putting on camo and going to the front lines. Exhausted workers at the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe trying to protect not just Ukraine, but all of Europe from a nuclear disaster. A cellist playing beautiful melodies in the bombed-out remnants of a town square to remind people that despite Putin's worst efforts, culture, love, and humanity are in Ukraine and not going away. In September, President Zelensky reminded us in front of our Constitution at the National Archives, and I was honored to be one of the few members of Congress invited to attend that event. He said, "There is not a soul in Ukraine that does not feel gratitude to you, America." I saw this firsthand in Kyiv just last year. I went there with Senator Portman. We were one of the first official visits. We went on the train all night from Poland. It was at a time when the embassy personnel that were actually staying on cots in the embassy for their security. And they told us a story that day, that one evening when they had picked up a takeout order at a Ukrainian restaurant, a restaurant employee didn't know they worked at the embassy, knew they were American, wrote on the bag, "Thank you for the HIMARS." New Ukrainian parents are even naming their kids HIMARS. That just shows one example of what our support has meant and will mean into the future. U.S. aid is protecting territory and saving lives. That's why now more than ever we must stand with Ukraine. And that, of course, means getting both member states that want to be part of NATO into NATO. And that means, as Congress continues to negotiate the budget, we must find a way forward to support Ukraine. In the Senate, there's bipartisan support for aid to Ukraine. As Senator McConnell recently reaffirmed, think of it as an axis of evil: China, Russia, and Iran. This is not just a test for Ukraine. It is a test for the U.S. and for the free world. And the path toward greater security for all of us is simple, he said: help Ukraine win the war. If we do not stand strong against Vladimir Putin now, he will see a window to continue to push across Europe and into the territory of our NATO allies. Leaving the Ukrainian people to fend for themselves is not an option. The world is watching. China is watching. Russia is watching to see what the U.S. does next. Will we keep our covenant, our sacred promise to stand up for freedom and democracy? Congress must come together before the end of the year and make the world safer, not just for Ukraine, but for democracies across the globe. Over the past year and a half, in bright blue and yellow, Ukraine has shown the world what it truly means to fight for freedom. I think back to that moment hours before the Russian invasion began, when President Zelensky stood in the streets of Kyiv and delivered a simple, powerful message. 3 words: we are here. We are here. America and the rest of our NATO allies and countries around the world, from South Korea to Japan, heard that call and said resoundingly, we are here too. Against all odds, the Ukrainian people have defended their country against one of the largest armies in the world. We know that it isn't easy, but I remain optimistic that democracy will triumph over autocracy, that humanity eventually and ultimately must prevail over brutality. And yes, that the Ukrainian spirit in the bright blue and yellow will prevail.
On behalf of the University of Minnesota and the Ukrainian American of Minnesota, the Ukrainian American Community Center of Minnesota, I am very grateful to her, to Senator Klobuchar, for her remarks today. I will now turn to the rest of our panel. I'll begin my remarks by talking about some background to the war, where the war stands now, and make a few points about the counteroffensive, and then we'll turn to Maria to talk about the situation inside Ukraine. 90 years ago, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin used famine in his attempt to eliminate Ukrainian resistance to the Soviet takeover and Stalinist policies. The Holodomor, or the extermination by hunger, was a genocide that led to the death of at least 4 million Ukrainians. As we speak and gather today, Ukraine is about to enter the second winter of yet another genocidal assault on Ukrainian independence and identity. It is day 629 of the war that Russia launched when it invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. And it's 10 years since Russia forcibly annexed Crimea and started a proxy war in eastern Ukraine, a war that the West largely ignored. Since then, since 2022, over 6 million Ukrainian citizens have become refugees. More than 5 million Ukrainians are now internally displaced. Almost 18 million, which is roughly a third of the population, over a third, are in need of humanitarian relief. Tens of thousands of civilians, including children, have been killed in indiscriminate Russian strikes that seek to terrorize the country into submission. As in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and Georgia, Russia does not distinguish between civilians and combatants. Russia is targeting all Ukrainians in a policy of rubblization of Ukrainian homes, apartment buildings, schools, and infrastructure. Torture, rape, and the abduction of thousands of children are among the countless war crimes that Russia has committed, crimes that the ICC has condemned. Russia is again using food as a weapon of war. This July, it ended the grain export deal. It even strikes at grain storage facilities and shipments. Most recently, the Russian military declared that it would send Ukrainian POWs to the front line in violation of the Geneva Convention. Month after month, Russian violence continues unabated. Vladimir Putin has made it chillingly clear that in his view, Ukraine is not a people and Ukraine has no right to exist. Russia's imperialism and culture of war have not changed. Few in the West took the Russian threat seriously in 2014. Since 2022, many have finally recognized that Russia's war is not a war, it's a war not only against Ukraine, it is also a war against the West and the liberal international order. This is neither the first, nor will it be the last of Russia's attempts to undermine democracy on its borders and beyond, whether by force, as it did in Georgia in 2008, and as it continues to do in Ukraine, or by cyber attacks on Estonia, or by attempted electoral manipulation elsewhere. The past 21 months of war have revealed that Russian ambitions and brutality, however, have not been matched by the preparedness of its military for combat. Its logistics have been woefully inadequate, corruption has eroded military supplies and effectiveness, its troops exhibit low morale, they lack commitment to either Putin or the nation, desertion is kept in check because officers shoot soldiers who refuse to advance on their orders. Putin failed to anticipate a united, fairly well-trained, and adaptable Ukrainian army, despite its newness. It's an army honed by 10 years of war in the Donbass. Given our weak response in 2014, Putin also failed to anticipate that Ukraine would be backed militarily by the West. Putin's miscalculations have led to a strong counteroffensive by the Ukrainians in 2022 and again in 2023. And massive Russian losses Russia has not seen since Hitler invaded the USSR. Ukraine has destroyed over 5,300 Russian tanks, over 10,000 APCs, over 5,600 UAVs, 322 aircraft, 324 helicopters, and even major vessels of the Black Sea Fleet, and the list goes on. Professor Dubovic, had he been able to join us today, would have spoken to the striking success that the counteroffensive has had in using drones and missiles to attack Crimea. Would you put up the first slide, please? Ukraine has driven the Black Sea Fleet from its Crimean base to the eastern edge of the sea. The number of Russian soldiers killed so far is almost 10 times the number killed in the Soviet Army's 10-year war in Afghanistan. The Pentagon estimated in August 2023 that there had been over 120,000 Russians killed in action and another 170 to 180,000 wounded. Thousands perished in the Battle of Bakhmut alone. The Prigozhin mutiny, which the world watched this past summer, suggested deep discontent within the ranks of Russia's military and paramilitary fighters. Indeed, the Ukrainian defense and the counteroffensives, both in 2022 and even this year, as Senator Klobuchar just noted, have been impressive and have significantly depleted Russian forces. And with Western backing, Ukraine has regained about half the territory that Russia occupied with the initial invasion. Could you show the next slide, or slide one, please? Thank you. However, the past 21 months have taken a high toll on Ukraine's forces as well. Although combat casualties are not fully known on either side, the US government estimated in August of this year that 70,000 Ukrainians have been killed in action. The wounded number likely from 100 to 120,000. This is a sizable number, particularly for a much smaller army by comparison with Russia's. Ukrainian military commander General Zaluzhny himself recently suggested that the counteroffensive has stalled and indicated that the war is at a stalemate or a standstill because Ukraine lacks the weapons to make a breakthrough along the long southeastern front. Could you show the next slide, please, which gives a closer up view of the front. What does this mean moving forward? We turn to the last slide then, please. On the one hand, the US has given over $75 billion in aid already, including about $46 billion in military aid, a historic sum. The Baltic states and Poland have committed even more if calculated as a percentage of their GDP. Western support and weapons have helped to keep Ukraine alive. In doing so, we also serve our own interests by degrading Russia's broader threat to the West. On the other hand, as the war grinds on, fissures in Western unity have certainly appeared. The cost of the war is high. Many voters are frustrated. Many Western governments and publics unrealistically expected a quick and successful counteroffensive, and this has not come to pass. Some in the US believe that the current standoff justifies pushing Ukraine to unfavorable negotiations, accepting significant loss of territory, or perhaps even abandoning Ukraine's defense. Before blaming Ukraine and pushing for an unacceptable peace, I think we should consider some pertinent elements of our own failures to make the 2023 counteroffensive a success thus far. First, we should remember that over the course of the war, despite our massive aid, we have seen a continual mismatch between Western rhetoric and the delivery of the military means to enable Ukraine to actually win. General Zaluzhny's assessment reflects much of what President Zelensky has been saying for months in his requests of Western states for more military aid. Ukraine needs air power, electronic warfare, more advanced drones, and longer-range, high-precision strike capabilities to break the impasse and move the counteroffensive forward. For well over a year, such requests were denied. In the meantime, Russia lay deep in dense minefields and dug trenches and tank traps. The first few M1 Abrams tanks only arrived this September. President Biden pledged F-16s to Ukraine, importantly, and finally this past May. But pilots will only be trained by next spring, a year too late for the 2023 counteroffensive. The US administration just recently approved sending ATACMS, but only those with a more limited missile range than Ukraine needs. Those weapons, like others, have come with a strict limitation that Ukraine cannot strike Russian territory where logistics hubs, command centers, and airfields are all located. Second, and also critical to note, is that the extensive Western sanctions imposed in 2023 have not been adequately enforced. The oil price cap has been regularly circumvented by those such as China and India. Weapons and dual-use technology circumvents export controls and makes its way to Russia from Iran, Serbia, most likely China, among other places. It transits Russia's long border with Kazakhstan and also its border with Georgia. In 2022, Russia imported $2.5 billion worth of semiconductor technologies, up from $1.8 billion in 2021. Such sanctions violations feed the Russian war machine. In short, we should recognize that there is far more that the West could have done already and should be doing now to help Ukraine win, not simply to survive. Finally, Russia shows no signs of changing course, so the West itself cannot afford to weary. As Alexandra Matvichuk, the Ukrainian human rights activist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, said, "The people of Ukraine want peace more than anyone else in the world, but peace cannot be reached by a country laying down its arms when under attack. This would not be peace, but occupation." I want to turn now to Maria to discuss public sentiment inside Ukraine, among other issues, and certainly the situation in the occupied territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, both for bringing all of us, both speakers and the audience together, and for organizing all this, and also for this incredible starting point and overview of what is going on in terms of military campaign on the one hand and political landscape on the other hand. I can just make a modest comment about that unfortunately we all, by all I mean both part of Ukrainian society and especially our Western friends and partners abroad, both in societies and among politician elites, we were caught by our own a bit overestimated expectations from 2023 military campaign, military counteroffensive campaign, exactly because the flow of the resources to support all the goals which were set to militaries, actually, the flow of resources was much slower and much more moderate and restricted than we expected. And at the end, we appeared and we found ourselves in a situation when military staff, both inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, were saying that this is not enough to fulfill the goals which were predetermined for the counteroffensive, meaning like huge operation which will allow Ukraine to make a breakthrough into the southern part of the front line, at the same time keeping at least stable the situation in the very east of Ukraine, namely in Donbas. And as a result, actually, we have to now not just having all this in mind, all this understanding that actually instead of huge breakthrough, which is not possible without support from the air, from the land, without enough number of longer range missiles, Ukraine will be or must continue with the constant and stable but rather moderate pushes on the specific parts of the front line in order to save the most valuable resource which our defense forces have. These are people, trained people. We shouldn't forget that as of now, Ukrainian army is not a professional army when we in classical terms. These are just former civilians, just yesterday they were bakers and they were doctors and they were consultants in the shops, and now they are being trained for a number of months and then brought to the front line. This is how it looks like. So as of now, this is not the time when we have to make some conclusion. This is not the time to push Ukraine towards unacceptable negotiations or unacceptable concessions towards Russia, but instead readjust the policy making and decision making about military and defense support to Ukraine with the real goals and resources which we are trying to back this military campaign on the ground with. So sorry, but you just inspired me to make a comment about that. And definitely I will concentrate more right now on what's going on inside Ukrainian society, because I think to many societies abroad, even in the countries like US, sometimes even in the Eastern European nations, which are closer to Ukraine and understand Ukrainians probably on day-to-day level better, there is still some questions which are not answered yet about how do Ukrainians feel after 20 months into the large-scale war, whether the resilience is still as high as Ukrainian politicians are saying in international arena, or there is a gap between what's going on inside society and what our political elites say internationally. So that's why I would like to show a couple of slides. Now I will share my screen. Just knock with your head, someone, if you see if you see my presentation now. Is it okay? Is it visible to you? Great, great. So first and foremost, which we have to keep in mind right now, that at the end of 2023, the resilience and the level of the people, and what is even more important, not just belief but certainty in Ukraine's capability to win over Russia, it remains incredibly high in comparison to many international conflicts which took place in the history. In particular, according to nationwide public opinion polls, as of now, like it was before, at the beginning of this year, last year, about 90% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine's armed forces are capable of regaining control over the entire Ukrainian territory. Moreover, the results of still continued counteroffensive, according to more than 80% of Ukrainians, it's not the reason, it's not the cause to stop counteroffensive or liberation campaign at all. So if the results are not as impressive as someone expected, then it's not the cause to stop all this. And more than 80% believe that Ukraine should continue to try to liberate its territories, even in another, according to another tempo or dynamics, but still to continue to do so in 2024. Another question which also is very important in this regard is that when we speak about military developments on the ground and about political component of everything which is going on around Russia and Ukraine war, the idea of negotiations, the idea of possible going back to some kind of talks or looking for some basis for at least a ceasefire, they are heard louder and louder within last months, when those expectations I mentioned previously about huge breakthrough were not met by those who had those expectations. But it's important that as for Ukrainian society, all the concessions and compromises which refer to Ukraine's sovereign rights to make its sovereign decisions or to territory of Ukraine are not acceptable. As of now, for instance, and this number is pretty stable, it's not just the result of the latest public opinion poll, less than 5% of Ukrainians would be ready to agree that the already occupied territories should remain under the Russia's control, even if in exchange for that, Russia would promise the end of this stage of the war. So this is not that deal that absolute majority of Ukrainian society would agree to. When we speak about the war, usually we go to describing what's going on within state institutions. We were speaking about interest of various allies and partners of Ukraine and Ukraine itself, interest of Russia. But in the case of Ukraine, the war became really the matter of people on the ground, because absolute majority of Ukrainians, it's almost 70%, are personally involved into various types of volunteer activities, either physically or financially, or both financially and physically supporting various groups of Ukraine who are related to some warfare or groups of society which were harmed by some kind of war consequences. And what is even more important, that this kind of volunteer activity, this is not the phenomena of just the one part of Ukraine. It unites various regions across Ukraine, and in all the macro regions from the very west to the very east. We are observing actually that the share of people who were involved, who are involved in various types of help and assistance, either to defense forces of Ukraine, or to temporarily displaced people, or to just other people affected by the war. So that share of people volunteering for them is significantly bigger than those who abstain or deny participation in volunteer activity. So this is a horizontal connection between various groups in Ukraine. This is not just army fighting somewhere in a vacuum. This is something which is backed by entire society still, even after 20 months into the large-scale war. Compromises, I wanted to show you, I wanted to show our audience a very good example and very actually sane example about the compromises which are being discussed. So because usually we can hear the formula that at some point any conflict, any war will end at the table of negotiations. Not necessarily this formula is being explained like that negotiations might look very differently, from capitulation of one of the sides to some kind of a political deal recognized by side, or some kind of a fragile and not stable ceasefire in between these two scenarios. But we have gathered, as a researchers, a couple of compromises which are being discussed, especially in the West, as for some kind of formula to end the conflict, and checked whether Ukrainian society is ready for that. As I have already said, only less than 5% would be ready to sacrifice Ukrainians' territories, which are under the Russian control, in order to end the war where it is now. I mean, just to freeze in the front line, accept the reality, like Russian side likes to say, this is not acceptable for Ukrainians. Another demand which was presented by Russia, for instance, during Istanbul talks in March 2022, that Ukraine should significantly, severely reduce its military capacities, namely the number of Ukrainian army, trainings, exercises, connections to their other countries' armies. Again, for 80% of Ukrainians, this is not possible, that in order to end the war, Ukraine would agree to reduce the size of the armed forces or reduce its military capacities and capabilities. Another extremely important issue and very popular for adherents of the idea to start negotiations, regardless that there is no conditions for those negotiations, is just to make the NATO membership of Ukraine some kind of a bargaining chip. So maybe Russia would be ready to go into negotiations if Ukraine will officially or de facto refuse from the idea to join NATO. And when political elites and military elites of Ukraine are saying no to these proposals, they are not presenting just their own view. This is the reality of Ukrainian society, where 74% are saying that they are not ready to sacrifice that. I have been studying public opinion of Ukrainians regarding the conflict-related issues since 2014, and I must say that before 2022, to refuse from NATO membership in order to end the conflict with Russia was not acceptable for majority of Ukrainians, but this majority was less than 74% by 20%. So basically, the situation of 2022 just made Ukrainian society in various regions of Ukraine more certain and more confident that this is the right way and probably the only one way to really secure and guarantee national security of Ukraine. You don't need to follow actually all the details described here. I was just intending to show you that Before the 2014, NATO was rejected by majority of Ukrainian society. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were a non-bloc status country, which was kind of not a neutrality status. It was a creature of, at that time, President Yanukovych, who presented this norm to Ukrainian domestic legislation, saying that we are non-bloc country. And at that time, it actually reflected the opinion of significant share of Ukrainians, because the security option number one, according to numerous public opinion polls, was actually non-bloc status, 42%, before the end of 2013, before the Revolution of Dignity. The option number two was military and political union with Russia and other CIS countries on a post-Soviet space. And only 13% of Ukrainians before 2014 supported the idea that it was NATO the best guarantee for national security of Ukraine. And 2014, not 2022, changed everything. So let's just keep in mind that when we're hearing that Ukrainians are struggling for their NATO membership, it's not the new idea of 2022 or 2023. This is the tendency, very stable since 2014, when being outside of any defense and security alliances with at least some kind of international guarantees and umbrellas appeared to be a vacuum of security for Ukraine when Crimea was annexed and when the war in Donbass was started. And the last but not least point, which is also somehow very oftenly underestimated when we try to understand what Ukrainians think in the times of the war, how they perceive themselves, is the question of national identity and self-perception of Ukrainians. So basically, since the beginning of independence or regaining independence in 90s, majority of Ukrainians constantly view themselves first and foremost as citizens of Ukraine. So when it comes to political self-identification, but regional and local self-identification, when you consider yourself first and foremost to be a representative of your city or your region, and only then someone else, among others, like a citizen of Ukraine. So regional and local identity was also strong, not overwhelming. Majority supported that, but it was also strong. And again, 2014 changed everything. So that's why when in 2022 we are observing, since 2022 we are observing a boom in refusing to speak Russian language, even for those people who didn't, make any connection between whether they speak Russian or Ukrainian. They consider themselves to be citizens of Ukraine in terms of political identification. In 2022, they consciously refusing from using Russian, just to underline that they are considering themselves politically, culturally, and in all possible ways, first and foremost, representatives of the political nation Ukrainians, and not like as representatives of their smaller community. So basically, this is backing Ukraine's policy and vision that Ukraine cannot sacrifice its sovereign rights to decide about whether it should join you or NATO or not, with whom to establish alliances, how to develop its army, because the entire image of ourselves is about a complete separate from other countries' cultural and political entity. And this tendency has only strengthened in 2022. And this is just the last point in this regard, that absolute majority in any macro region of Ukraine are showing that they are proud to be the citizens of Ukraine in the times of the war. And this is actually that kind of irrational component which makes people still be active on the level of volunteering, on the level of supporting the army, on the level of being conscripted to the army voluntarily, or even if they are conscripted like by conscription officers, but they are doing that. And my last but not least point, very shortly, about the people in occupied territories, probably during the Probably during the Q&A sessions, I will go deeper into that. But just to tell you that one of the ideas of Russia, since they captured within the first couple of months last year, captured the territories in south and in the very east of Ukraine, one of the very first tasks were to wash out anything which could be considered Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian in those territories. That's why what they are doing from the very first day, they were entering any city, any settlement, just to deprive all the books, anything to stop any somehow Ukraine-related activities, to change the programs in the schools. This is huge machine of brainwashing. Russia is very professional about that. And they are counting with the time flow that people, especially in other countries, even among partners of Ukraine, would start thinking then, have a look, wait, those people, if they are still there, I mean, Ukrainians in occupied territories, if they are still there, so probably it's not that, important to rely on that argument when they're thinking whether it's possible to go into negotiations or not. And I will just give an example that some of the cities, some of the towns in currently occupied territories were almost fully empty when Russian army entered there. I'm originally from Luhansk region. In Severodonetsk, before Russian army invaded that part of Luhansk region, there were 128,000 of local population in Severodonetsk, which was administrative center of Luhansk region at that time after 2014. When the last units of Ukrainian army left the city after the long-lasting battle, there was no more than 8,000 population left there. So, and this is the story which was duplicated in other towns in Luhansk region, in Donetsk region, where the battles gave people time to leave, and basically Russia captured land with cities, with settlements, which were 90% empty. But these people were, so to say, luckier to live at that time, because as of now, it's not that easy, it's not possible automatically to leave Russian occupied part of Ukrainian regions, even if you want to do so, even if you have money. This is very costly because Russia is still controlling the border between Russia and Ukraine occupied territories. It's absurd, but this is the reality. They're putting stamps into the Ukrainian passports of people in occupied territories. Stamps saying the entrance to Russian Federation is prohibited. What does this mean? That these people are locked in occupied territories. For what? To make them start working for Russia, to make them be humiliated. Especially this refers to people who were somehow related to Ukraine, pro-Ukrainian activity, and somehow didn't leave the area in time. Russia, since 2022, completely closed all the checkpoints between occupied and Ukraine-controlled territories. And as of now, it's simply not possible to just go somewhere and cross, because everywhere is the front line. All the front line is mined, heavily mined. And the only way to leave occupied territories is to go to Russia, to go through all the FSB control and border control, and you're gonna be stopped in a couple of kilometers from where you start your journey, and you have no chance if you were hiding for some reason in occupied territories but still want to save your life. You have no chance but to try to leave the area through the Russian Federation, where you most probably, if you are related somehow to Ukraine, to Ukrainian activities, pro-Ukrainian activities, is gonna be cut. So in my opinion, absolute majority of the people living in occupied territories under these conditions, under these circumstances, should be treated as hostages. Of course, someone started working with Russians, and Ukraine will have to react to this. But as of now, the very first task is to liberate not territories, but liberate people living under these conditions, under the aggressive state, whom they do not belong to. And that's why Ukraine should be supported, still supported on its way to do this. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Maria, for those extremely deep and informative remarks, and for the really sort of personal feeling of what's going on in the occupied territories. I'd like to turn now to Colonel Bagdonas, who will speak from Vilnius. I'd like to just remind the audience that you can type in questions through the question function. I've had dozens of students who've been sending me emails as well with questions, but if you were just connected by Zoom, you can type in your questions through that question function. Thank you. Colonel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Kathleen, for organizing this. It's my great privilege to deliver my thoughts. Actually, I would like to share my views or points on two issues, actually. Why Ukraine must win the war, why Ukrainian victory matters for international security. That is the first. And the second, I would elaborate a bit shortly on major two factors from military perspective, major two factors that determines which side wins or lose the war, in any war. So Ukraine must win the war, and there is no other options. There are no other options how to rescue and preserve the international legal order, which was demolished by Russia 24 February, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion. There is no other way how to stop atrocities, to defeat genocidal projects implemented by Kremlin or by Russia. And there's no other way how to prevent a major war, and not only in Europe, but beyond. If Ukraine wins, that means Russia loses. And Russia's ally, Iran, loses. And then China, too, has to be very careful to refrain from escalating the situation in the Pacific or in Southeast Asian region. On the contrary, if Russia were to win, let's imagine, unimaginable, the world would, I'm absolutely sure the world would be plunged into a major war. Putin doesn't hide his intentions. If we see even currently, his Minister of Defense or War Ministry, Shoigu, Chief of General Staff Gerasimov, they're discussing, they're sharing their plans, how they're structuring of defense forces going on, actually. When the Western military district of Russian Federation, they have 4 military districts currently, and the West military district is this, which is bordering with North Europe, East Europe. So now it's under restructure, and they're going 4th generation, and Russia plans to split this district into the 2 parts, and they very clearly stated they're preparing for the war with NATO. That's publicly available statements, and they're also augmenting military capabilities, augmenting, increasing number of divisions, and so on. From the military, coming to the second point, what determines which side, based on historical example, based on military theory, what the major points, what factors which determine which side wins, this loses the war. Actually, the outcome of the war and the Russian war in Ukraine will be determined by two factors: by the will to fight the war, will of people, will of society, and the second by resources available on both sides. So let's look on both. It's everybody perhaps agrees that Ukraine has clearly have superiority in terms of the will to find a war. Reiterated Ms. Maria, which gave us very, very detailed and clear picture on the perception or opinion or surveys of Ukrainian society. We see that absolute majority of population of Ukrainians are determined and united, and they have no other even thoughts that there should be a different way. And myself, I visited Ukraine as member of humanitarian organization in very beginning of war, when we transported women, old people, kids, and then autumn and winter almost 1 year ago. I saw huge determination among the people in different layers of society. I had the possibility to talk to simple people in Dnipro, in Kremenchuk, in Zaporizhia, and some other smaller towns and cities, in Kiev, of course. So talking to people, I saw a kind of notion of strong resilience, if I may, and everybody believes it, and it brings me sometimes confusion when I hear on international media outside Ukraine, when people are speaking about the ceasefires, truce negotiation, whatever. They do not imagine the situation in Ukraine, and the strength of Ukraine lies in its society. And I truly believe that when we witnessed the incredible counterattacks of counteroffensive operations of the defense forces of Ukraine last year, when the Kiev region was liberated, Kharkiv region, then Kherson, western part of Kherson district. That's absolutely clear for me that the defense forces of Ukraine, which were much, let's say, less capable from military perspective in numbers. Russian military forces at that time overcome Ukrainians definitely significantly, but still they were defeated. They were forced to leave, and this operation was also firstly influenced, of course, on professionalism, on good performance of military personnel. Reiterated Maria, many of them, they were former civilians, and that's the strength of Ukraine. However, Russia is learning. Russia is learning also from Ukrainian defense forces, and mainly because Russia has much higher internal resources. In spite that there is also they find way how to receive different means for industry, and another reason, because Russian society is strongly influenced by propaganda, by and because it's indifferent to losses of human beings, it is most likely that the war will be prolonged, and perhaps it will take several years. Now, having international support provided by partners, which is unprecedented, very big, but it's still insufficient. And unfortunately, many times international support comes with delays, or it's basically insufficient. And I think that strategy to support Ukraine is not based on an Ukrainian victory, unfortunately. I believe that a defeat of Russia is being avoided. That's the major issue, and this is a mistake. Having such policy, the war will take a long time, but will end with the same outcome, but different consequences. And having long war, Russia is being given time to rebuild its forces. So there's only one way to help Ukraine to win the war and to liberate territory and people in occupied territories. That is to give all the tools, all the means, including political support, perspective for NATO membership, and ultimately NATO membership, and all what Ukraine needs. Thank you for this. I'm prepared for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Colonel, and thank you for being so disciplined about keeping to the time, unlike us. I would like to now welcome remarks from Professor Zhorevsky-Vilgraevsky. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, talking after such outstanding presentation is difficult to add something new, but I will try to divide my presentation into three main parts. The first one is devoted to the very description of the nature of the war in political dimension of it, and the reasons, the roots of the war, its perception from the Polish point of view. The second one will be the answer to the question, what should be done in that situation? And the third one, the most pessimistic, unfortunately, is what will be done. What is necessary is much easier to formulate, but then I think that the odds, whether it will be done or not, are rather pessimistic, are bad. So first, what is the nature of the war? First, I would like to stress the fact that Poland is extremely experienced at wars with Russia. We fought 18 wars since 1492, and all the Russian wars looks like that. We share that experience with Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Lithuanians, so I'm afraid nothing new will be said to our partners from those countries. But we do remember that when Great Duchy of Lithuania lost Smolensk in 1514, Russia behaved in the same way. I mean, the population was swept out, partly murdered, partly deported deep into Russia, and then settlers from the inland Russia were settled down, and the city became Russian one. When Russian army took Vilnius in 1655, it was burned during 2 weeks. More than 20,000 of people in 17th century were murdered, and so on. When they took Warsaw Raid Bank in 1794, they did the same. 20,000 of people were massacred. When they entered the Second Republic of Poland in 1939, more than 600,000 of people were deported deep into Siberia, into Gulag. The same was done with the Baltic states and so on. And not only Poles, I mean, Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, we all know the nature of the Russian war. It's cruel, and it's based on the political goal that could be described in the best way with Russian word. I hope our partners will understand it, obezchoroblienie. That means the decapitization, the elites must be exterminated. And that's the point about the last Russian invasion on Ukraine. Please remember that Russian army entered Ukrainian territory in February 22 in the march order, not in the battle order. Nevertheless, they took the mobile crematoria with them. What for? Now, if they entered in march order, they didn't expect heavy fightings. So the crematoria were prepared to annihilate Ukrainian elites. And we saw that. That is the obvious policy of Russian occupying forces, not only in that war, but in all other wars we remember from history. And this is why I can only support what Mrs. Marina Zolkina said. Yeah, it's not about liberating the land. It's about liberating the people, compatriots, the citizens, that cannot be condemned for the eternal slavery under Russian occupation, because that partly means extermination and partly Russification, or deportation somewhere deep into Russia, and of course that crime, namely the fact that a lot of Ukrainian children was kidnapped and then sent deep into Russia, is another proof of that thesis. So this is the nature, the cruel nature of Russian war. What are the reasons? The reasons are pure ideological. So this is why we cannot appease the monster with land. Russia is the largest country in the globe. If there is a shortage of anything in Russia, for sure it's not square kilometers or miles of the territory. So the real sin of Ukrainians was democracy. They elected the president and they changed the parliament. 70% of the deputies in the parliament were changed just by voting in an electoral way in 2019. That is a real crime from the point of view of the ideology of Ruski Mir. If Ukrainians who are treated in Russian propaganda as in fact Russians can elect the state authorities, that means that Russians could do the same. And it is completely unacceptable for the Siloviks mafia from Kremlin. So in Polish memory, it looks like 1791, we adopted Constitution of May the 3rd, together with Lithuanians, and then we were invaded by absolutistic monarchs that could not tolerate democracy in the neighborhood. This is exactly the pattern of and the reason of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So it cannot be negotiated. I mean, the fact that what we have just heard from our Ukrainian partner, Ukrainians don't accept the compromise based on the formula Land for Peace, not because Ukrainians are stubborn, but because they are reasonable. I mean, you cannot buy peace in that way. You can buy only the strategic break that would allow Russia to recreate the resources of munition, to train new reserves, and to start next war, next invasion in a few years. That is well known from the Chechen history. I had the first Chechen war, then a short break, and then the second Chechen war. So you cannot make peace in that way. You can only achieve the strategic break that in fact will be a favor towards Russia, because that will be the time given for Russia to rearm, to retrain, and to divide the West, to work hard about the Western unity, to destroy it. So in that sense, from the Polish perspective, since we know that we are second in the queue, there are debate whether Lithuanians or Poles or Latvians, but generally speaking, we are the second in the queue. And we know that each Russian tank destroyed in Ukraine and each Russian soldier, sorry to say it in that brutal way, killed there, will never appear in Poland to kill us. That's obvious. To stress our support for Ukraine, I would say some personal, emotional reflection too, just as our Ukrainian friend. The overwhelming majority of Poles had in our family memory the cruel memory of the Second World War. And we know what does it mean to be refugee. Entire Warsaw was cleaned with the people who were kicked out by the Germans, including my grandmother and my 7-year-old father at the time. And I have heard those stories of refugees since I was a small boy. So today, when we see Ukrainian women and Ukrainian children, we see our grandmothers and our small parents fade in their experience. It's not only about cold knowledge. Yeah, it's just the emotional experience of being again, in fact, in the same situation due to the same eternal enemy of our nations. And for the first time for last 400 years, or 300 and a half, we are in a massive way in the same camp with Ukraine. Yeah, that is a miracle from the Polish point of view. We reconciliated that hard history sometimes, but in that new situation, it was very important. What should be done? First, our main conclusion is that the security system to protect our country we have built since 2014, especially after 2016, after the Warsaw NATO summit, when the system of NATO protection of eastern flank, that means forward presence and deterrence by punishment, that was built, the battle groups in Baltic states, in Poland, the Canadian, British, German and American presence on our soil to deter Russia is not enough. This system of deterrence by punishment allows at least temporary occupation of this or that part of the country. It's completely unacceptable. We are not interested in liberating massive graves. And this is why we need to build up the system of the deterrence by denial based on forward defense and not forward presence. This is what should be done. And of course, as both the colonel and professor said, Ukraine should be supplied with all the tools, all the material, political and military, to defeat Russia. But these are just our wishes. It will not happen. Sorry. The window of opportunity, according to my opinion, is over. Namely, we are in the electoral year in the United States. United States is a democracy. For obvious reasons, the politicians will rather promise to reduce the burdens that are on the shoulders of the citizens than to boost them. That's one of the factors. And of course, the attitude of the United States is the crucial one due to the American potential. From the Polish point of view, we cannot trust European forces. They are too weak, they are morally and physically undetermined. And another important factor is that we are at the eve of the heavy political battle within the European Union about the future shape of the Union. That probably will win, at least in the short time, with German and French victory, which means in combination with the latest change in Poland, that means the government that was challenged by the Russian invasion on Ukraine and dealt, in my opinion, quite well so far, giving full support to Ukraine, will be replaced with a new one that will line up with German and French policy, which means the reduction of the support. Of course, there will be lip service, but the material support will be reduced. To our Lithuanian friend, the most serious candidate for next Polish foreign minister is Radosław Sikorski. I think it speaks for itself as far as Polish-Lithuanian relations are concerned. So we are about to enter the period of internal tension within the European Union, and at least reduction of the political attention of the political class of the Union and of the United States towards Ukraine, and profound reduction of Polish activity. There will be no next tank coalition created by Poland, or aircraft coalition, or anything else. I mean, Polish activity, governmental activity, will be probably reduced and subordinated to Franco-German line, which will be based on the political will to seek the compromise with Russia and to renew the business as usual. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that there will be next war. Because I fully agree what you have said. I mean, the war can be ended only with Ukrainian victory, but to be understood well, that sentence doesn't mean that Ukraine for sure will be victorious. It only means that unless Ukraine is victorious, the war will not be ended, but there will be next war. And that's the problem. However, we know it. I don't think that there is enough peoples, enough nations in Europe that are of the same opinion. We can count on Baltic states, on Scandinavians, on Britain. I think just unclear is the future position of the United States, because fortunately for us, both parties are fully aware, I mean, Democrats and Republicans are fully aware of the general universal importance of Ukrainian independence and victory for American interest all over the world. That will be something that would create the context of Chinese policy towards Taiwan, of Korean policy towards South Korea, North Korean to South Korean, of the Middle East context, and so on. But to add just an urgent, almost imminent threat, well, it's an imaginable scenario that 2 million of Palestinians from Gaza will be pushed across Egypt to Libya, then transferred to Belarus, and that thrown on Polish or Lithuanian or Latvian border in the framework of hybrid war. So, as you can see, this security system is interconnected, whether it's Middle East or Far East or Europe. And this is why our task, Polish task, Ukrainian task, Baltic state task, is to arm ourselves, to be able to say to our American friends, look, we treat the threat seriously. We have already done our best to meet the challenge. Please help us. We don't ask you to pay the costs instead of us. Just we need your potential, because our potential, however fully used, is not large enough to win. But we cannot ask Americans to pay the cost instead of us, which is the case of the Europe general policy.
Professor.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Given that we're running out of time, may I just ask some of the other panels to pick up on some of these very important points you've just made, because we also have multiple questions coming in about that as well.
Okay.
If you want to just wrap up with 1 minute, and then I think we'll get into this issue of what exactly.
So, final conclusions. The only way to stop Russia is the military way. All the others ways are illusion. And it's not because we want like that, but because this is just reality. American factor is absolutely indispensable. Without Americans, we will fail. European Union as a source of resources is unstable and uncredible as far as military dimension of the conflict is concerned. German and French policy towards Russia will be rather an obstacle, and Polish factor is under the process of reduction as far as the future activity in the region, in the months at least to come, is concerned. That's all.
Thank you so much for those extremely in-depth remarks and analysis. I just want to pick up on a number of questions that have been put in through the chat and sent to me by email, which also relate to points that all three of you speakers have made. One of which is, why does the West not seem to be committed to a Ukrainian victory as opposed to just Ukrainian survival? And what would a Ukrainian victory mean? What would it look like? A number of questions have come in. And what does this mean if we settle for something less than a total Ukrainian victory? What does this mean for Russia going forward and for future war between Russia and the West, or between Russia and the Baltics, Poland, or Ukraine? Maria, do you want to briefly address that first, and then I'll turn to the Colonel and Professor.
Yeah, I'll be happy. Actually, I hear this. I hear this question about what is the victory for Ukraine since the very beginning of the large-scale invasion. The answer is very clear. It's not just about the occupation of Ukrainian territories, but this is an integral part of Ukraine's victory for sure. But I must make it very clear that for Ukrainian experts on regional security especially, the war won't be automatically over, even if Ukraine fully controls its entire land, because it will just move to the border between Ukraine and Russia. The problem is with aggressive foreign policy on the side of the Russian Federation, which is pursuing its its political goals with military means, because political means didn't work out. That's why for Ukraine, victory is necessarily, absolutely, full deoccupation, full liberation of currently occupied territories. But this is the reaching of stable and more or less predictable security situation in the region. By speaking about that, what is the predictable situation? When Ukraine find itself in some kind of circumstances within or inside a specific security architecture, which will be either updated or developed after this stage of the war in this part of Europe. Because when we think about victory of Ukraine, we should not narrow it just to Ukraine's interest. Ukraine has two seas. One of them is shared not only between Ukraine and Russia, but with NATO member states. And we currently observe that Russia is blocking the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, the freedom of economic and trade connections, just because they're controlling the air and the water in the Black Sea, and they're trying to block actually the normal trade, and so what even to speak about any kind of military exercises would be normal in a normal situation. So basically, this is when Ukraine will be able to develop with its partners the new security or update for already existing security architecture, which will prevent Russia, actually make it impossible for Russia even to try invade another time, to start another war against Ukraine. For me, it's NATO membership, but not only and exclusively this. I mean, in addition to NATO membership, which is priority number one, it would be specific military defense and security alliances with specific countries, especially in the Central and Eastern Europe, having the same view on Russia as Ukraine has, like a vision that this is a threat. And I hope that strategically, Ukraine would make its best to develop respective relations for the future, for the decades to come, not just for 2023 or 2024, for the decades to come with Poland, with Baltic states, with Finland, exactly because we have common security challenges, common security threats, and we should actually develop this cooperation, which we're having now, into a strategic partnership for the years to come. And very briefly about why West is not committed, so to say, as you said, to Ukraine's victory. The West is different. And while Poland and Baltic states are barely sometimes giving almost anything they can, in terms of weapons, for instance, to Ukraine. Some countries are helping, like US, but this is like a small part of their military and defense capacities, though US is definitely the donor #1 to Ukraine. But why West is committed to very moderate, I would say, approach when it comes to Ukraine's victory? Because they lack a number of political elites. I'm afraid, including in US, still lack a vision what to do with Russia. And this is at least from Ukrainian perspective, we can't at this moment find other arguments why Ukraine is not given anything it could possibly use for the best during the shortest possible period of time to bring Russian army to defeat. Because no one in Washington, in London, in Berlin, in Paris can automatically predict what will turn out to be in Russia, what political regime will replace Putin's regime, whether it will be easier to communicate with the new regime. I don't know what can be worse than current regime, but they still fear that might be something far right. Let's imagine how moderate was reaction to Prigozhin mutiny attempt. And that's the answer. As soon as there will be more clear vision that Russia, with this aggressive agenda, is a threat, regardless, is it under Putin or under anyone else, there can't be normalization of security situation in the region. If you don't have clear vision about Russia and you fear that Russia will collapse, it will be a problem for the entire region, then you would stop yourself from helping Ukraine.
Thank you, Colonel.
Yeah, I have too little to add. Just as very much agree that there should be a strategy what to do with Russia. After military defeat and a liberation of Ukrainian territory coming to the 1991 borders, then the modern countries partners, they need a leadership. I agree that it's not easy. Leadership, which would unite nations and to work really on sanctions, blocking the Russia. Well, there was a question even addressed on the energy policy, on the dependence on Russian oil. I would add on gas, perhaps. That's the major income. It may sound naively, but example, my country, and I know perhaps Poland and some other countries, we have zero dependence on Russian energy. We work hard. We were fully dependent on Russia, and on Russian energy resources. But we have to understand, as long as Russia is receive funds from the trade, oil, gas, it helps to continue war. And well, in a way, we all share a responsibility for this if we live in democracy, and it's all of our responsibility for the atrocities in Ukraine, for the war crimes in Ukraine, because for the money received from Western and not only taxpayers, Russia is able to buy missiles, to produce missiles in the end, and to other hardware. And that's after the military victory. Well, after in parallel, actually, we have to do something with this. There's no other way. I don't have a recipe, but the Moscow, Kremlin, Russia has to be shaped very much. And to be aware, Russia is not national country. It's an empire. It unites, I believe, more than half of Russian inhabitants are not ethnical Russian. So there I will stop.
Thank you, Professor.
I think first, strategy towards Russia must not be limited to the military one. In that military dimension, shortly speaking, we need rather Tsushima than Verdun. I mean, Russian political system must be shocked. The war of attrition that has just started, it's the way to disaster, because Russian resources are larger than Ukrainian ones, and the support of the West cannot be stable. The only end of the war, as Professor Zolkina said, cannot be achieved just by the full liberation of all the territories. It's not enough. We have to change the regime in Russia, but again, it would be an illusion to expect that the result will be the democracy in Russia. No, I think the most probable result will be chaos. The pattern that we in history know from China after 1911, there were warlords, in fact criminal entities, fighting of the right to loot the local population by the military leaders in the region. Speaking about leftist or rightist forces in Russia is just funny. It's like to consider whether Al Capone was rightist and Corleone was leftist. Yeah, it's senseless simply. So this is not the case. And of course, there is a risk. The choice is between chaos on a large territory where nuclear weapon is deployed in, and the imperialistic power, aggressive, that is invading neighbors from time to time. There is no other choice, unfortunately. There is not democratic, peaceful Russia ruled by nice people in the main political menu. We have to pick the dish up. So politics is about hard choices, not idealistic wishes. Yeah. So that's the first dimension. The second question, namely, why the West is not doing all what is necessary. Because it's democracy and the citizens are right. I mean, the perception of threat is not wrong in the West. France is not threatened with a Russian invasion. So the readiness of the French citizens to pay the costs of stopping Russia is substantially different than the readiness of Polish, Estonian, or Ukrainian, or Lithuanian, and so on. Scandinavians are quite sober because they are in the Russian neighborhood. Spaniards are an exemption because they had the fresh experience of the Russian support for the Catalonian separatists. Nevertheless, the main challenge is the immigration, massive immigration from Africa, Middle East, from the Mediterranean basin, and the governments are occupied with that issue, not with developments in Ukraine. And we just have to accept reality and to count on the resources that are in a realistic assessment at our disposal, and not idealistic wishing that we would like all the people of goodwill to help Ukraine. That will not happen simply. And that's the most important observation. And finally, what should be done? That's up to Americans. I think the United States have to get rid of the illusion that there will be a smooth cooperation between the United States, the leading European power, that means Germany, and Poland, in favor to stop Russian imperialism. No, it will be not, because Germans are not interested in such a cooperation. And the problem is that you can build either the system based on the eastern flank of NATO, plus Ukraine, that means Sweden, Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, Romania. By the way, we have to do something with Belarus. That's a separate large topic. And we should be supported by the only superpower that exists. And we should be aware of the fact that Germany, as the exporting economy, is eager to open the Chinese market and cannot act in the one block with the United States in that dimension too. And there is a large tradition of Russian-German cooperation, and it's still vivid. Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 has not been dismantled. Yeah, the Russia-NATO founding act was not renounced in Vilnius a few months ago. Candidate status to Ukraine was not granted. Why? Who was against? Yeah, so these are the real facts we are confronted with. And the only power that can change the nature of the game is the United States. We can help, but we have not enough power to do that. So it's up to Americans.
Thank you. Hopefully our politicians on both sides of the aisle are watching. I'd like to I'd like to get in one more question that a number of individuals have put into the chat and emailed me, and this has to do with Ukrainian strategies, tactics, the way of warfare and how it has changed, and whether or not they can continue this war of attrition with Russia and perhaps ultimately take back greater territory despite the division in the West, through the use of new drone technologies and the other sort of innovative technologies that they have shown themselves to be so skillful with over the past year and a half or more. Colonel and Maria, perhaps you can.
Actually, yes, we see, we observe the huge impact of modern technology. And another question that was also in parallel what you have asked, just the cyberspace as well, including cyberspace, which is less invisible, but the huge impact on warfare. Recent General Zaluzhny's article published in The Economist, and revealed that Ukrainian Chief of Defense openly shared that that's what he expects, or Ukrainian military command expects to increase technological superiority. And that's a lot of things we in other countries, Lithuania, Poland, in NATO, among NATO alliance, we will be learning a lot from Ukrainians, and we currently do this, of course. So it's shaping nature of war very much, modern technologies.
Couldn't turn on the mic. Definitely within last 20 months, so the tactics have been completely different when it depended on the times. But at this moment, it's not it's not that complicated to understand that the first priority for Ukraine as of now is first and foremost to reach in south, to reach as close as possible to the administrative border with Crimea, to reach in terms of priority, to reach the Azov Sea, which was the goal. Why was that? This is very, from military point of view, it was very difficult to fulfill, exactly because while Ukraine was begging about sending its arms and everything, starting from the liberation of the right bank of Kherson last year at the end of 2022. During all this time, Russia was doing two things. On the one hand, they were distracting huge numbers of Ukrainian military personnel in Bakhmut battle, long-lasting and human and time and resources consuming. And second thing, they were developing all these defense lines. And actually, when if previously without those defense lines. The breakthrough was possible using just mechanized brigades without full-fledged support from the air. After all lands were dozens of kilometers forward in front of Ukrainian armed forces were mined, it's not possible to do that as easy as it was imagined. So, but we don't see any, at least from Ukraine, we don't see any evidence that Ukraine will completely stop its attempts to reach Azov Sea, and I will just explain why. Basically, Crimea is treated from security, from military point of view, to be even more important than the mainland of Ukraine. That is why the closer you are to Crimea, the more military capacities you have, not just to step into Crimean Peninsula and start an open battle, let's say, in the styles of the First World War, Second World War, like Stalingrad or something, but you would be able at least to block Crimea, which is now serving as huge military base for Russia, not only for Russian Black Sea Fleet, but generally Crimea is backing everything that Russia is doing in south of Ukraine, and as of now in the east also, because they have access direct from Crimea to the very east of Ukraine, just using Ukraine's mainland along the coast of the Azov Sea. That's why the first and foremost goal is to reach that place. As of now, they're trying, Ukrainian forces are trying to reach Tokmak. This is a small town in terms of Ukraine, but very important logistically, because this is the railway spot which connects all the railway connections between Crimea and southern Ukraine on the one hand, and Donbass on the other hand. So Ukraine is trying to break, both by mechanized brigades and by using longer range missiles, which we are really in need of, trying to break all possible logistical connections and in Russia occupied territories, to deprive Russian forces of the means to sustain the counteroffensive at some point. So that's actually what's going on, and I think that this kind of tactics is going to be continued for the next time, while Russia will be using the same tactics as they used around Bakhmut. Bakhmut, by the way, is still, the warfare again around Bakhmut is still going on, by the way. So this is not like the completed story that Russia just entered, Wagner groups at that time entered the city and everything is come down, and no, it's all the battlefield like it was, but now Russia has opened, pretty similar to Bakhmut, the same tactics against Avdiivka. Avdiivka is just 15 kilometers from the territories which are occupied from 2014. So basically this was the very front line. But what Russia is doing to Avdiivka is the same tactics to wipe out the city from the surface of the earth, and to distract as much skillful Ukrainian forces as possible. Because the idea of Ukrainian forces, if you leave the area like Avdiivka or Bakhmut, then it will cost you much more to enter the city and to fight for this city again. That's why they were standing for Bakhmut, and that's why they are standing. Ukrainian forces are standing for Avdiivka.
Thank you, Maria. There are also some related questions about the importance of the Crimean Peninsula and whether or not Ukraine is likely to push forward with the counteroffensive there, using larger numbers of troops, and to what extent this is likely to result in intolerable casualties, really, either on the side of the Ukrainians or the Russians. Could any of you comment on that question, please?
Well, I think that we should start with quotation of what Napoleon said. When you are at war, never do what your enemy wants you to do. And the fact that your enemy wants you to do that, it's sufficient reason for not doing that. That means that if Russians prepared so elaborated fortifications in the occupied areas, and they want Ukrainians to attack them. They shouldn't do that. Russia is interested, for obvious reasons, in what I have already said, a set of Verdun-type battles. There were a lot of soldiers engaged, and casualties are enormous, and so on. Because war of attrition will be won by Russia. While Ukrainians must impose a shock on moral shock on Russian army, Russian society, and Russian government. And this is the basic calculation. That means that the weapon Ukrainians should be supplied with by the West must be a tool to achieve that goal. For example, when we have experienced the sink of Moscow cruiser, that was a heavy moral blow against Russian military morale and prestige. If the entire Black Sea fleet is sunk, that which will demonstrate to the Russian society that the Russian government is helpless. Crimea, of course, is a symbol. I know it's difficult to liberate it, but the loss of that territory would be a political disaster for Russia. Russian government doesn't care about this life of soldiers, but about prestige, of course, it does. And since the goal is regime change in Russia, as we have already said, the war will not be ended with those people at Kremlin. It's impossible. It's like to make peace with Hitler. You can try, but there is no hope for being successful. So the nature of Russian regime is that the regime is hard, is stable, but is fragile. Please remember that Japan won the war in 1905, not by occupying Moscow or Petersburg, but by crushing the prestige of Russian Empire on the battlefield, the prestige of the government. That must be smashed. Well, I'm not military specialist. I cannot say now what kind of weapon should be given to Ukraine. But of course, long-range missiles in order to hit Russian bases all over the Black Sea and Russian political and military centers in inland main Russia. Russian territory must not be sacrificed or sacrificed, as protected by some unclear reasons from being a target for Ukrainians. Why? It's war. We cannot win the Second World War without bombing the Third Reich. So we should do the same with Russia. Russian population must be convinced, not by leaflets, but by missiles, that they are about to lose the war. And that's the real task for the West and for Ukrainians. The problem is that human resources of Ukraine are limited and are getting to be exhausted. And what is known in Poland since ages, nations attacked by Russia sacrifice crème de la crème of very young people, while Russia is losing barbarians. And that's the problem. And the best young men and women of Ukraine are giving their life, which is destructive for the country. Russia, well, some people from province, remote regions, and this must be changed. By Ukrainians with weapons. Ukraine should be supplied by the West. But again, in my opinion, unfortunately, that is wishful thinking. It will not happen.
That indeed is a problem that General Zaluzhny mentioned in his article last week, is that the reserves of the Ukrainian forces are unfortunately far more limited, and it's becoming a problem for the manpower of the Ukrainian armed forces. Colonel, could you comment about whether or not the arrival finally of F-16s in the coming months with trained Ukrainian pilots can possibly change the situation on the front?
There is not one such, unfortunately, weapon which would drastically change the situation on the ground. No, of course. However, air superiority is needed very much for Ukrainians. It's so obvious. Please remember, 24th February 2022, Russia had overcome Ukrainian Air Force, probably I counted once, 12 or 14 times. In the beginning of war, Ukraine had, well, maximum 60 aircraft, and about half of them, they were extremely obsolete. But still, well, afterwards, Poland, Slovakia, and maybe a few other countries provided Russian-produced or Soviet-based MiG-type, Sukhoi-type aircraft, and they maintain more or less, let's say, maybe a bit better level. So, answering your question in more detail, in the weapon systems, in the weapon platforms, we have to look we have to assess in complex as all weapon systems. It would be a huge, of course, positive impact on Ukrainian side, but not well. But still, the Ukrainians will need many other things, as their jets such as F-16 is not only needed to support land forces to target Russian military targets in the occupied territories, but also to protect airspace. Now winter is coming, and again, our countries have to be prepared to support Ukraine in this. And the air defense assets, they are not covering absolutely 100%. They are always the surveillance system. They time by time, Russians, they are not stupid. They're overloading Ukrainian surveillance system. So on this gap of which might be covered by Russian missiles and other means of attack, like drones, can be eliminated by jets. So, of course, in the complexity, this is one of the, in my view, it should be one of the priority to provide Ukraine with jets. But as I said, it would not be as some kind of miracle weapon which would absolutely change the course of war.
Thank you. We have other questions about the morale within the Ukrainian army and conversely about morale within Russia. Maria, would you like to talk about, given some of the bleak conditions that we have been discussing for the past 20 or 30 minutes, would you like to comment on the morale of those serving within Ukraine? I mean, your extremely detailed and rich presentation on Ukrainian society was really enlightening and important for Americans to hear. Do you find the same sort of continued support for fighting amongst the fighters themselves?
The answer here, when it comes to people who are serving, is very clear. They are much more rational, to sometimes even cynic, because they are basically seen much more than ordinary people, even if the ordinary people are involved in any kind of support to the army. But the morale is pretty high, because basically what I'm continuing to repeat, that you can make, or you can ask political leadership or even military leadership, so let's say a leader of the country, to go in for negotiations, whatever. But if the country, if society sees this way as some kind of even treasure, some kind of a betrayal, so it's not possible. So you can't simply make people fight if they are not willing to fight, because Ukrainian army is very different from Russian army. And regardless of being outside of NATO, the structure, the hierarchy inside the army is really pretty democratic. So a lot of decisions are being made on the lowest possible level. Initiative is not only allowed, but is needed in order to respond. And actually these tactics presupposes that people fulfilling these tasks on the front line share the idea why they're doing this. Because otherwise, having a possibility to step back, they would do that. And this is not happening. My answer is very personal one, let's say, because people who are already serving, majority of them did this voluntarily. Like my family, for instance, I have 12 people in my family, 7 of them are serving. All of them, except for one woman who was just serving on a contract before, everyone else just appeared in conscription office in the first days after Russia invaded. And as of now, these people have just this open contract, unfortunately. So basically, there is no strict limit when these people are going to be returned. And that's why they have no reason just to do their work as effectively as they can. But I insist that this is a good combination of being, on the one hand, rational. This means questions both inside the country to something which disturbs them about decisions, about supplies, about what's going on somewhere, not on the front line, but in political cabinets, but do not forget about what they're doing and where they are and why they're needed there. And actually, if you ask, at least I have this personal experience, if you ask the people serving in the army whether we need to fight for our land, for our people further, even with limited resources, or probably, because this is lives and health, probably we should go for some other political solution, the price which was already paid is considered actually not the cause to start negotiations about concessions, but actually the reason why we should do what we have started by repelling the Russian aggression. But that's also absolutely, I'm absolutely conscious about, and this is a problem of Ukraine, of course, in comparison to Russia, that Ukraine has a different strategy towards its human resources in the army, and we have people serving, and they need to be rotated. So there are problems because we really have less population than Russia, so we can't just waste people's lives and health. And public opinion polls, which we conducted not among soldiers, but generally nationwide, like one of those I showed to you, we actually asked people also, among other questions, whether they are ready to join the army, because basically everyone who was very eager to join has already done so. But we asked people, so if you are approached by the conscription office, so what would you do? And still there is about 8 to 10% who are saying I'm absolutely open. So I'm just here where I am, waiting, and and the general mood in the society is that everyone, or almost everyone, will have to fight at some point on a different position. So I'm very serious when I'm saying that former civilians are militants and servants right now. Many women and men from my professional area are going voluntarily now to find some military profession for them, to get prepared. If in a couple of years the war is not over and they would need to serve, to be prepared for that. That's the reality.
Thank you. And this is a striking contrast from what we at least know about how the Russian military is fighting and the Russian population in terms of its willingness to actually serve in the Russian military.
Moreover, if I may, I'm sorry, Kathleen, I can't, unfortunately, I don't know why, but today I'm not brief. But speaking about Russian army, there is one very significant difference between the motivations, and this why people were or are joining Ukrainian army voluntarily, and why or they did so or just agreed to conscription in the Russian society. In Russian society, the strategy of Russian leadership is to grab as much population from far from the center regions, which are the poorest one. Usually they are the regions inhabited by national minorities. So Russia is basically reaching or fulfilling two tasks. They are decreasing the level, the possibility of any kind of uprising by grabbing young men from Dagestan or Ichkeria or Buryatia or any other region far away from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But on the other hand, what the phenomenon of these people, many of the people conscripted there, is that they are ready to fight, not because they want to fight, but because they earn money which they have never earned in their very poor regions. And if these people are being killed on the front line, at some point their families got a reward, compensation, which is kind of something to them. I barely hear nothing at all like about money as a reason to go to the army, though during almost all the period of time the salaries were pretty good. And this is also impossible that Ukraine is paying salaries to Ukrainian soldiers from its own taxes. This is also important for our Western audience to know. This is not from the taxes of Americans, Brits, Poles, whoever. This is a kind of a deal that Ukraine is gathering taxes and paying the salaries to the army from its own budget.
Thank you. Those are really incredibly important points for us to understand. And you're absolutely right. Russia is pulling people out of the prisons. It's pulling in migrant laborers from Central Asia and other areas and forcing them into the military, or trying to bribe them in the military with salaries that they will probably never actually earn. What do we know more generally? I have some questions asking this about Russian public opinion. There have been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Russians, especially men of military age, who've gone across the border to Georgia, to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. They relocated wherever possible. What do we know about what's going on inside Russia and the public mood? Both Professor and Colonel have pointed out that the military leadership doesn't seem to have changed, much less Putin, in terms of their commitment to continuing this war against Ukraine and the West. But what about the Russian people? How long are they going to stand for this? And is there any possibility, some questions are asking, of a scenario like Afghanistan, where after a long war of attrition, public opinion starts to actually matter? Colonel, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, what based on different readings, discussion, attendance, different sources, I think absolute majority of Russian people are somehow absolutely trying to ignore, trying to they're absolutely outside the reality. They are influenced very much by propaganda. They live, we say they are zombicized, like living in different information space. And unfortunately, there are a number, I read a number of studies, researches, even attended one seminar provided by researchers from Kiev who do this permanently surveys. There is not so big hope there. I would make a guess that or estimated numbers, there's 5-10% who may want some changes, but the numbers very little. And moreover, I have a perception that because of growing scale of propaganda, the casualties, thousands of casualties in Ukraine, sometimes giving opposite result. They inspiring kind of hatred against Ukraine, against us. There's one of the widely spread rhetorics among disinformation propaganda that Russia fights against United States, against Western countries. So and unfortunately, I think majority of population believe this, and they absolutely in alternative reality.
Yes, I think that is an incredibly worrying phenomenon, that in fact they do believe, many Russians of different generations, in fact, do believe much of this propaganda. Maria, do you get a sense of this from ethnic Russians whom you know, either in the eastern parts of Ukraine or the occupied territories? What is your sense of what they are believing from the Russian propaganda machine?
Actually, there is no so many Russian ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, and not so many. So there were a lot, and still you can find like significant share of Russian speaking Ukrainian, but it was also one kind of misunderstanding of Ukraine before 2014 and after 2014 that Russian speaking Ukrainians are Russians or pro-Russian, and from this point of view, so basically ethnic Russians, so there are just quite a few in Ukraine, and they have never been organized in any kind of a national minority, like Hungarians, for instance, or Armenians or Bulgarians are organized. But I hope that, so this situation is changing. But speaking about occupied territories, Russian propaganda is relying on the TV, complete both local TV channels and Russian major like mother TV channels. But the most important that they have using all the possible means to deprive the population of all the possible, except for the internet via VPN, to use other alternative internet resources. It doesn't help that much as of now, but it was really powerful and still is powerful, especially in the small settlements, in the villages, where people are not as active politically or in terms of civic engagement, or if they are living under this informational vacuum, within this informational vacuum for a long period of time. But we can't measure how effective that Russian propaganda is. My personal connections in occupied territories saying that situation is changing in terms of people who were pretty silent after 2014 and were silently pro-Ukrainian, waiting the regaining of Ukraine's control over occupied part of the Donbas, for instance. They are now starting sometimes speaking loudly, because what Russia is doing is definitely contradicting to what Russian propaganda were saying to those people in occupied territories, because now it's obvious for anyone that Russia started this invasion and not Ukraine invaded previously occupied territories, because that was the basis of Russian propaganda, that Ukraine would organize a military campaign to invade Donbas. But practical steps which Russia is doing in occupied territories, as of now, in my opinion, would be a good basis for people to distrust even well-established propaganda in many cases. One very good example, The conscription which Russia started was not, while officially in Russian Federation, the conscription campaign overall started only in September 2022, after Russia failed with its blitzkrieg aggression against Ukraine, and they declared the so-called annexation of part of Ukrainian territory, and they declared so-called partial mobilization, which is never exists. So this is basically mobilization, conscription of the people. But the first wave of conscription was announced 5 days prior to Russian invasion of entire Ukraine. It was so-called officially launched mobilization in previously occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk region. When in 1 day after this announcement, streets in Donetsk, Luhansk, Gorlivka, and many other towns and cities in occupied part of Donetsk and Luhansk regions appeared to be completely female-looking, no males outside, because no one wanted to fight. And that was the best answer to how much support did Russia have with all its propaganda among ordinary population. Of course, there is some share of people, we don't know how large is that, of course, in occupied territories before 2022 and now, who are putting these pro-Russian narratives. But on the other hand, having a look at the practical steps, people are not willing to fight. People who were the military units which were comprised out of those forcefully conscripted men in temporary occupied parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. They were the first in a row in many cases to, I forgot this word in English, sorry, when they are giving up on the battlefield and asking to go to be like a POVs, the prisoners of war. So
deserting probably.
Yes, probably. So basically because they have absolutely no idea why they are fighting. And Russia treated them as a cannon fodder. So if we speak about Russian army, which is sent to the front line without equipment, without countlessly like using people and using them, then people from the occupied territories who were conscripted to the Russian army, but were united in separate units on the battlefield, they were treated by Russian leadership, military leadership, even worse, because they are not needed. And simultaneously, what Russia is doing to people, they are sending the groups of reconstruction campaigns, companies of parties of people coming from Russia to, so to say, rebuild Donbas, Mariupol, south of Ukraine. Basically, this is imperialistic practice of substitution of cleansing of local population, substitution them with people from inner Russia, and just deprive people of any means, you know, to get out of the area, both informationally and physically even.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Professor?
Yeah, I think that in order to understand Russian reality, we have to be very precise in using different terms. So first, I will start with something maybe surprising, but there are no citizens in Russia. They are only subjects. Russia has population, but has no political nation that is separated from the state. And then we have a mixture of different phenomena. That means the population of capital cities, Moscow and Petersburg, that is in some sense out of the war burden, because the conscription, the mobilization is not touching those people for political reasons. The rulers from Kremlin are wise enough not to provoke detention in those big cities. The province has criminal nature. I'm sorry to say that, but it's not the area in which the ideas, revolutionary ideas, democratic ones, to change the regime, to organize the public life in another way can be born. No. they are ready to serve either because of fear. It's extremely dangerous to resist Russian state. You can get killed. Second, because that's a good opportunity to rob the others and just to loot the foreign country and to get richer. If you're extremely poor, is attractive, as we have already heard from Professor Zokina. And then there is that imperial ingredient in that. That means Russian perception of Ukrainians is that Ukrainians are not just normal enemy, they are traitors. Yeah? They betrayed the motherland of Russia. They don't want to be Russians. We know it perfectly. We are in Poland. I mean, we are the traitors of Slavic world. Yeah, everybody is Orthodox. Stupid Poles are of Latin, right? Yeah, so we are in the same category. Ukrainians are even worse. Yeah, because they don't want to be Russians, and we don't want to be obedient Slavs under Russian rule. And in that sense, this is the appealing ideology to those people who are not directly asked to pay the price of the war. I mean, to the population of Moscow and Petersburg. That's quite good to have this kind, whether it's real or superficial, that's another issue. Yeah, but that can help a lot to maintain the stability in the large cities. Smaller villages, countryside is too large, the population is too dispersed, too ill-educated, and too poor to rebel. And as we have already said, this perspective of getting rich by looting foreign country is an attractive one. And of course, we had, well, more than 1 million, even 2, I guess, of the young people that fled the country. But these are mainly that westernized specialists or young people, or again, criminal mafias that is not interested in sacrificing anything of its own business. So that's the mixture. And the last observation, when Wagner troops of Pirogozhin started this mysterious rebellion, call it like that, what happened in the cities or villages that were taken by the rebellion troops? Lootings. Yeah, the people started to loot shops. So these citizens, as I have said, there are no citizens in Russia, but those natural links in the social one that in normal countries exist between citizens collapsed. Just using the historical analogy, there was a short period in 1915 during the First World War between the time when Russian army left Warsaw and German army didn't come yet. And the public order was maintained by citizens. They organized in order to avoid criminal activity, all the criminals that are in each nation. Yeah, in Russia, this kind of self-organization is impossible, which says us a lot about the nature of the country. So at least we in Poland, we have no illusion about the successful pro-democratic rebellion that can end the war. No, it will be rather the struggle for power at Kremlin. Please remember that the Soviet Union was dissolved in order to get rid of Gorbachev by 3 other people who wanted to reshape the power. Yeah, so one of the conclusions is that, of course, Russia is an imperialist country, but Russian political class struggling for power is able to dissolve the empire. Lenin did it in 1918 in Brest-Litovsk, and Yeltsin in Vyskovo in Białowieża forest. So this is another pattern. Yeah? So the moral level of Russian society and of Russian army is a mixture of those several factors: criminal desire for looting others, imperial ideology, the struggle for power, and the lack of ability to create the other political system in the country, because democracy never existed in Russia and nobody is experiencing that.
Thank you. We are well over our official time limit, and I am heartened to see that so many people have still stayed connected. I know my whole classroom was connecting from a room at the U of M campus as well. So I know a number of students have to get to their next classes, and probably many of you connecting from the Baltics, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere. It's late in the evening there. I do want to give each of the panelists 1 or 2 minutes to wrap up with any final thoughts. There are dozens of questions, both in the Q&A function and that have been emailed to me during and before the panel that we have unfortunately not been able to get to, but I want to give each of the panelists a chance to either address any of those questions that they see or anything that you think you would like to emphasize or that we have not been able to cover. Marie?
I have tried to in a written form to answer several questions, so I typed the responses, at least to those who were posed to me. I think it was very extensive, so thank you one more time for doing this, because honestly speaking, despite of a lot of Ukraine-related voices or Ukraine-related events internationally, let's say, everything depends on which audience you are targeting. And thank you very much for just bringing together both academia and political policymaking people together and to this distinguished audience. So thank you for that. And my last but not least point in this regard is that this is the war which Russia is waging against Ukraine is not the war against one country. And this is gonna change. It has already changed and will gonna change the entire landscape, political and security, and also economic, and also even climate security, because environmentalists would say a lot of words about why Crimea should be liberated, because since Russia occupied it, Russia has never allowed any international obligatory for many countries mission to visit any piece of the water around Crimea and to study actually what's going on when Russia is building up their military capacity in the region. So there are a number of reasons why Crimea and other parts of Ukraine have to be liberated, why countries supporting Ukraine politically and militarily should continue to do so, because this is not about today. This is about the entire region. This is about the precedents for international law, when aggressor, whoever is it, should be punished for what they are doing and should be brought to responsibility. And saying about Ukraine's victory, I truly believe that there should be enough readiness on the side of Ukraine's Western partners, both inside societies and among political elites, to say no to concessions to Russia until Russia is changing from inside. I doubt that disintegration of Russia is the worst possible scenario. Probably at some point, weaker Russia and weaker even several states within current borders of Russia would constitute much less threats and challenges for the entire world. And this is how we should assess the possibility. Is it affordable politically for US or for someone else to support the idea to defeat Russia completely? Should we fear the disintegration and destabilization of Russia or not? In my opinion, current regime violating all possible international humanitarian norms and laws is actually the worst for the world possible. If Russian society agrees to that, that's their choice. But this kind of united Russia with nuclear weapons is a threat to everyone. And that's why if victory of Ukraine not necessarily will, but might provoke significant destabilization inside Russia, up to some kind of beginning of disintegration tendencies, this is definitely not the worst scenario if you want peace no aggression, and no unification of authoritarian regime around the world.
Thank you, Maria. Professor.
Yeah, I have just noticed that there are two questions written and asked personally to me, both very complicated. One about the grain and now transport crisis on Polish-Ukrainian border, another one about the historical dimension of Polish-Ukrainian relations, whether they were erased by the war or not. Well, the second one is in some sense easier, in that sense that to the large extent, yes. I mean, the rising of the issue of the Second World War massacre of Polish population in what is today Western Ukraine, today in Poland, in the large percentage of Polish society is perceived in two dimensions. First, as something that must be done, and it's Ukrainian task to solve that problem, because all the places where it happened are on Ukrainian territory, and exhumation of the victims, the gravestones and so on are up to Ukrainian sovereign decisions. Yeah, and we expect that task to be done, while we understand that Ukraine has much serious task to be done while fighting war. Yeah, and since all the pro-Russian forces very small in Poland, in fact, nobody officially can admit that he's pro-Russian. Yes, but how we detect that they are pro-Russians? Because they constantly say Wołyń. This is something that can help us to detect. Wołyń is the place where the massacre took place. Yeah, but saying that, I would stress two things. Ukrainians, while fighting Russians, won respect of the Poles. They show themselves as the noble nation fighting with weapon for their freedom against our common enemy. And we showed as much solidarity as we could. But please remember that we are normal democracy. Yeah? This country is still under the political process, and we have our own interests too. For example, this is the second question, the grain one, which is the symbol. In my opinion, unfortunately, that was the mistaken, I would even say the suicidal decision taken by Ukrainian authorities to take part in the political game, the political goal of which was to get rid of the present Polish government in the alliance with German pressure. Poland never stopped Ukrainian exportation understood as transit across Polish territory. Never. All the time the borders were opened. The problem was the illegal exportation on Polish markets. And of course, that would be a disaster, economic disaster for Polish farmers. And the government was put in front of the difficult choice either to risk the political defeat in elections due to the disrespect of the farmer interests, either to break the European Union common agricultural policy and to act independently. And European Union policy directed by Germany was aimed at putting the government in such a position, and Ukrainian government helped to do that against the Polish government. In our opinion, it's a suicidal policy. But of course, we understand. I mean, we make a clear distinction between the Ukrainian government that made a mistake and the heroic Ukrainian nation that is defending the country against our common enemy. People sometimes have unreasonable governments. I can say it openly now because probably the next government, at least from my point of view, will belong to that category in Poland. So what? Yeah, we have to maintain the relations with Ukraine as good as possible, because that is our existential interest, we can survive only when we cooperate. If not, we will meet in Russian gulag or in a common massive graves with Russian bullets in our heads. And that's what is at stake. Yeah, there are mistaken politicians on both sides, but the basic interest is like that. And history, we cannot change the history, but we have to do our best in order for that history not to be repeated in the future. And the only beneficial power of any quarrel between Poland and Ukraine is Russia, and to some extent Germany. That's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shorosky. Pardon me. Colonel. Oh, Colonel, I think you are still muted. There we go.
Thank you very much indeed for this possibility organizing the event. I have answered I believe answered all questions which were addressed to me. As a final point, I would say we must not get tired supporting Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine. It's not only about Ukraine. It's about global security, and we have to remember that Russia tries to extend the war globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We are coming to a close, so I would like to simply emphasize a point where I think all of our panelists share agreement, and that is that this war that Ukraine is facing is an existential threat to Ukraine. It is a grotesque war, a brutal war. It's been going on for nearly 2 years already, and it is extremely likely that Russia will continue this war of attrition in the hopes not that the Ukrainians will back down, but that the West will back down. So we need to understand, as all of our panelists have emphasized, that this is a war which is against the West and against democracy in general. It is Russia's attempt to not only break down the security infrastructure of the West, but also break down the liberal international order, which the West has rebuilt since World War II. We have incredibly important both moral and security reasons to continue to support Ukraine, to give Ukraine what it needs for victory, as well as just to survive. So we need to adapt our strategy rather than simply give up on Ukraine because we think that the counteroffensive has moved too slowly. I will end my remarks there because we've had such a rich and interesting discussion, and I am deeply grateful to all of you for participating today and for sharing your rich experience, research, information, stories from the front, from visiting Ukraine, either Colonel Bogdanas or Maria, from your personal experiences in the occupied territories. Professor, from your rich experience in dealing with the Russian threat over the course of many years. I think no one knows better than Poland and Lithuania, as well as Ukraine, just what exactly the nature of the Russian threat is and what the implications are, not just for Ukraine, but for the surrounding countries and for the West in general. So we greatly appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. I also want to thank Senator Amy Klobuchar for contributing to today's discussion with her opening video. And I want to thank the Humphrey Institute, Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the Institute for Global Studies, and the Ukrainian American Community Center, which has been a great sponsor of this event as well. Thank you to all of our participants. We still have dozens of participants who are still there after nearly 2.5 hours so we're going on 2.5 hours now. And we could probably keep going as we did when I held an event like this about 1.5 years ago, when your colleague Maria Alexei-Haran was able to join us. My best wishes to everyone in Ukraine. We want to extend our thoughts and our prayers to Professor Volodymyr Dvorak, who was unable to join us today because of the situation in Ukraine, and his family. And we thank you and hope that you'll be able to come speak with us again. For those in the audience, if you have other questions, the emails of the participants will be available if you want to contact me. And hopefully you will be able to get in touch with them directly. And my apologies for not being able to address the dozens and dozens of questions that we've had sent in today. Thank you again to everyone. Thank you to all the tech staff and the Department of Political Science who've helped to make this event possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All the
Thank you.
best to all
It's
of
been
you.
my pleasure.